Cars zoomed by as I walked a mile and a half from my school bus stop. I hated walking home alone. The men in my neighborhood were like hungry sharks, and I was fresh blood in the water. They seemed to have no control over themselves or their desire. My mother paid the bills, but she was essentially checked out. She worked and slept. If I didn't learn how to cook, then I wouldn't eat. My mother was a roommate that was never home. I raised myself. When she was home, she would drink and berate me for ruining her life. Coming home sometimes was terrifying. If it was my mother's day off, I knew she would be drunk and in a foul mood. She often had men over whose groping hands I had to dodge. Though I hated the long walk home from the school bus stop, it was often more peaceful than the zoo that was at my home.
Damn.
A man shouted as he slowly drove past me. I looked at him. He seemed like he was in his 40s. He smiled at me, and I quickly averted my eyes and looked to the ground. I had discovered in my 12 years of life not to look at men in the eyes. For some reason, they take it as you being interested in them. Even as a child, grown men still mistook my stare for something sexual. His car looked as filthy as he did. His teeth were rotten and mixed with black and yellow. Ugh. He seemed as though he had not shaven or bathed in days. Please don't stop, I whispered to myself, praying that he would just continue driving and not try to talk to me. My slender body was barely starting to bud, and because of the stares and sexual advances of men, I intentionally wore my baggiest clothes to cover what little curves I had. But even that didn't seem to be enough. I wasn't an ugly girl. My skin was mahogany brown, like wet brown sugar. My hair was long and well brushed. I was poor and stayed in my room to avoid my mother and her male friends. One of the few things I enjoyed in my young life was just to sit and brush my hair. It became a way for me to escape. As I brushed my hair, my mind wandered to other places. I was told that I was pretty, but I never saw it. I just thought men said that as a way to get into my pants. The car stopped suddenly and started to back up. My heart started to race.
Hey, you want to ride home?
The disheveled and clearly drunk man asked. I didn't answer. I kept my head down and walked a little faster. I had been harassed by men like him so much that I began to fear black men. I always felt safer when I was around different races of men. They never looked at me as anything but a little girl who deserved to be protected and have a childhood. When it came to black men, they all seemed to want one thing when it comes to women and girls. They didn't care if I was a child, or if I was one bad day away from giving up and putting my mom's gun in my mouth and ending this life of mine that seemed to be doomed from the day I was born. All black men seemed to care about was sex. They didn't care if I wanted it or not. If you spurned their advances, they would get angry and attack you. I often wished that I was a different race of girl, not because I hated being a black girl. I was just terrified of black men and the blind eye that the rest of the world turned to us. The world could care less what happens to black girls. Black men know this and take full advantage of it.
You hear me, little bitch.
The dark-skinned man growled. My heart seemed like it was going to bust through my chest. I was breathing hard. I felt like I had ran a marathon. It was just fear. I kept my eyes on the ground and walked a little faster. I was nearly home,
You ignore me, bitch?
the man shouted. Before I could react, I felt something hit the side of my face. It seemed to explode on my cheek. I stumbled and fell to the ground. My head spun and my ears were ringing.
That's what you get for ignoring me, little skank.
The man shouted and drove off. I don't know how long I laid there on that dirty, cracked sidewalk that was stained with God knows what. I wanted to touch my face, but I was afraid to. I didn't want to see the damage yet. I couldn't handle it. My heart was racing so fast that it dulled any pain I should be feeling. I wanted to scream, but I knew that would bring more attention to me, and where I lived, being a girl in attention was never a good thing. I took deep breaths to try and slow down my breathing. My body shook and ached. I could smell the alcohol all around me. I figured it was a cheap liquor bottle he threw at me. I knew I had to assess the damage, but I was afraid to. I took a deep, shuddering breath and touched the side of my face that the glass bottle shattered on. Ugh. I winced in pain. Glass was still in my cheek. Oh, thank God the glass didn't hit my eye. I probably needed to see a doctor and get stitches. I knew my mother could not afford it, and I didn't want the beating that she would give me for the medical bill she would receive. I didn't know what to do. I laid there in the glass. My face was bleeding and swollen, and I stared at the evening sky. I hated crying, but that was the only option I had left. My tears stung the cuts on my battered face. I hated my life. I hated black men, and I hated my mother. I wondered if she suffered at the hands of black men like I have. I didn't doubt it. Black men seem to hate black women. There was no way for us to escape them. Maybe that's why my mother drank the way she did. Brushing my hair was how I made my mind wander, how I escaped the hell I lived in. Maybe drinking was my mother's escape. I remembered that incident like it was yesterday. I touched the scar on my cheek just under my left eye. It had begun to fade. And with the right kind of makeup, it would disappear altogether. My face looked normal. If I had gotten medical attention, that scar would have not been there. Instead, I had to drag myself home and pull the glass out piece by piece while trying not to scream and wake up my mama. I often wondered if that scar and that demon that entered my life shortly after were connected. It was nearly a year later I was walking down this same road when I met him. I was 13 and scared out of my mind. The scar on my face refused to be hidden despite my efforts to cover it up. It was like a pockmark on my otherwise smooth skin, a constant reminder that I was not safe around black men, that I was just a piece of meat, and they were a starved, salivating dog at the sight of me. Every time a car drove by, I could not help but flinch. Normally, I was the only person walking on the sidewalk. I guess I was the only person stupid enough to attempt it. Every day that I made it home was a blessing. I dreaded getting off the school bus, knowing I had to walk through this war zone to get home. This was the worst part of my day. I felt like I was walking through a minefield. I can't describe the relief I felt every time I saw my mother's door off in the distance. Of course, my mother's house was a different stress altogether, but at least I felt safer than being out in these streets.
You gonna be polite this time?
A familiar voice shouted at me. My heart sank. I will never forget the sound of that man's voice. The man that threw his liquor bottle at me. I timidly touched the scar on my face and winced. The scar didn't hurt, but the memory of that day was painful. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to encourage him and end up being raped. I also didn't want to get hurt again. I looked up at the middle-aged black man and smiled. Tears of pure fear ran down my cheeks and past the glaring scar on my face. My heart was beating so fast I felt I would pass out.
That's better.
The man said. He smiled, showing a row of yellow and decayed teeth.
That liquor bottle wasn't wasted after all.
He said. I kept smiling and walked faster. I was not far from my mother's house. If I ran now, I could make it before he could turn around in his car, but my heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe. As much as I wanted to run, my body refused to do so. It was a struggle just to walk, let alone run or fight.
Slow down now.
The middle-aged man said. He looked disgusting. He probably smelled much worse.
Why don't you get in my car? Or do you need another lesson in manners?
The man said. I didn't know what to do. I stopped and struggled to catch my breath. I knew I was going to black out. I could feel it. My vision started to blur and fade in and out. I knew if I had passed out, he would rape me and dump my body somewhere. I had to slow my breathing and stay conscious. Almost every day, there's a story of black girls and women's bodies being found in the trash cans and alleyways. People would get on the news and pretend to be sad about it, gaslighting the world on how tragic they felt it was, but in reality, no one cared. Everyone loved to virtue signal and pretended like they cared about us while doing nothing to help us.
Drive away, you greasy old fuck.
A strange man's voice boomed. There was something different about his voice, something powerful, something that made you stop and notice him. The old man in the car stared at me for a minute, nodded, and drove away. I was still trying to control my breathing so I wouldn't pass out. I didn't know who this man was, but I knew nothing was for free. Black men didn't just help you because it was the right thing to do. There was always strings attached. He waited patiently for me to calm down and catch my breath. And there was something eerie about his presence, something dark and powerful about this man, something that both intrigued and terrified me. When I was finally able to slow my breathing and fight off the looming doom of passing out, I looked up. The man stood inches from me. I looked up to see him smiling. He was tall, his skin seemed flawless, a deep ebony that seemed to consume all light. He was handsome. His hair was long and curly, almost like he had it permed. I can't explain the conflicting emotions seeing this man triggered in me. His eyes were dark and terrifying, yet for some odd reason, I trusted him.
You okay, baby girl?
He asked. He held out his hand. He wanted to help me stand up straight. I didn't want to take his hand, but for some strange reason, I couldn't resist it. His touch sent electricity through me. His grip was strong but soft. He smelled like old sandalwood. I nodded and smiled at him. It was the same forced smile I gave the drunk black man in the car, a smile to ease the tension so I could leave safely.
I'm Jacob.
He said. He still held my hand and walked around me. He was examining my entire body. I felt bare before his penetrating gaze. I wore my clothes intentionally baggy to hide whatever curve I had at 13. But he seemed to be able to see through the baggy used clothes I wore,
You're beautiful.
he said. He leaned forward and touched the scar on my left cheek. He traced it from under my eye to just above my top lip. Everywhere he touched me seemed to tingle. I shuddered.
From now on, I'm going to protect you. You hear?
He said. I nodded. I didn't know what else to say. I was too afraid to disagree with him. I just wanted to get to my mama's house, run in my room and hide beneath the covers. I wanted this day to be over. I wanted my life to be over. I didn't know how many more days that I could endure.
Don't think like that. Your life's worth living.
Jacob said, pausing for a moment. I looked at him, startled. Did he read my mind?
Besides, I got plans for you.
Jacob finished. Something about the way he said that made my skin crawl. Can I stop here for today? I asked the therapist. She looked at me for a long moment and nodded. I sighed gratefully. Talking about Jacob and how I lived when I was a little girl was stressful. I hated coming to these groups. I hated having to relive the horrors of my childhood, remembering how isolated and alone I was, how every day was a struggle to not just give in and end my life. I'm not a religious person. I don't believe in some grand white man in the sky that dictates my life. I don't believe in the afterlife at all. Some people are terrified at the notion of slipping into the dark nothingness of death. Those people have not lived in hell on earth. Those people had something to live for, something they loved and didn't want to let go. All I had was pain. Scars like the one on my face that cover my heart and my soul. A cold, empty nothingness was a much needed and wanted existence to the purgatory that was my life. Maybe that's why this therapist chose us. She wasn't a normal therapist, not a shrink, so to speak. She was part of a group that investigated paranormal phenomena and those who survived it. I was extremely confused as to why I was here. When I was approached by her research team, I almost told them to fuck off until they told me that I would be paid for my time. The payment was substantial. I'm a black girl from the hood. We don't do paranormal. We don't play with that shit. You have to be a bored white person with no other real stresses in your life to want to focus on the dead. It was hard enough for me to make it to the end of the day. I had no time to worry or wonder about ghosts and ghouls. The sad thing about these strange investigators was they could not see the miracles right in front of them. I don't know the stories of the other two women in this group therapy session, but they were black women. Just surviving and being sane was supernatural for us. Dealing with the demons in the form of black men is what should be studied. If not surviving the cruel and vile culture of black men, it's surviving the one you gave birth to. There's something really wrong with black men. I'm not sure if it's some ancient African voodoo curse or some genetic mutation caused by the horrors of slavery, but something about black American men was definitely off. I took a moment and looked at the other women. It was odd to me that I was only just noticing them. I knew they were there, but I normally studied and sized up everyone I encountered. Growing up in the streets, you learn to really look at people and determine their threat level, so to speak. For some reason, I had yet to do that here. Looking at them, it was clear that I was the only hood or ghetto girl here. The other two seemed like well-educated and professional women. One looked mixed. Normally, I would write women like them off as being snobby and stuck up. Not because they made something out of their lives, but because they could not relate to a woman like me. Growing up in the streets is like growing up in a war zone. A chill ran down my spine as I looked at them. They both had a familiar, haunted look in their eyes. A look that I often see when I look in the mirror. A look of having encountered something horrific and survived it. For me, that horror was Jacob. I gently touched the fading scar on my face, a scar that was hidden beneath several layers of foundation, but a scar that still pained me. I was intrigued and wondered what they may have suffered to give them the same empty, hollow, haunted look that I have. The therapist turned to the lighter-skinned woman. She wore tight, faded jeans and a long-sleeve shirt. She was pretty. Her light brown hair was tied in a neat, curly ponytail. She was thin and looked like she worked out often. Besides the haunted look, her eyes were kind. But I could tell rage bubbled just beneath the facade, a rage that stemmed from a lifetime of abuse that you have yet to deal with. You just pushed it down and smiled through it because you realized that as a woman, no one cared about how you felt. Candace, do you mind introducing yourself and telling us about Brandon? The therapist said. Candace's pretty face winced in pain at the mention of his name. She traced what seemed to be a thin scar on her wrist and nodded.